Hello and welcome to Amnesty International and Fight for the Future's 10th Salon on the implications of web3 technologies for human rights and activism. I'm Leah Holland, Campaigns and Communications Director with Fight for the Future. I use they or she pronouns and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. Today's subject is government-backed digital currencies and the privacy concerns they bring. Major powers around the world are experimenting with central bank digital currencies, otherwise known as CBDCs, and proposals for a digital dollar issued by the US Treasury are floating around the US Capitol. It's high time for activists to engage in this extremely important issue. A digital dollar could allow us to reclaim cash's millennia-old privacy protections for our digital lives, if it were built by design to shield the privacy of everyday people. Alternatively, digital cash with surveillance backdoors could herald a new level of financial surveillance and control from both governments and their corporate intermediaries. Many decry surveillance in its other forms, biometric surveillance, communication surveillance, and more, yet they insist that financial surveillance backdoors are somehow necessary. It's time to ask ourselves who that harms and how those harms might compound as people in the US endure a major rollback of our human rights. Our panel today represents a spectrum of ideas and interests when it comes to the considerations going into a digital dollar and the threat of financial surveillance that it could pose. It's sure to be a fascinating conversation and a great way to start your journey as an activist on this incredibly important issue. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Michael Kleinman, Director of the Silicon Valley Initiative at Amnesty International.
Thank you all so much for joining. My name is Michael, and as Leah said, I lead Amnesty's work here in Silicon Valley, focusing on the human rights implications of technology for better and for worse. I am thrilled to introduce our panelists today. We will hear from 4 speakers. Fox Cahn is the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and also serves as a practitioner in residence at NYU Law School's Information Law Institute, and is a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, Ashoka and TED. Albert uses he, him pronouns and will talk on the topic of Surveillance 3.0, how the move to a cashless society means the growth of a surveillance society. Jennifer Lassiter is the executive director of the Digital Dollar Project, DDP, also serving on the World Economic Forum's Digital Currency Governance Consortium and the Progressive Policy Institute's Mosaic Economic Project. Jennifer uses she, her pronouns, and today we'll talk on the topic of, can a CBDC be private? How to define, design, and measure a US CBDC that enhances privacy protections. Alexandria LaRue is the co-executive chapter director at Sex Workers Outreach Project USA. Alexandria is a queer disabled sex worker and activist from Texas. They have experienced all aspects of this work and enjoy expanding their knowledge and helping others stay safe. Alexandria uses they, them pronouns and will speak on when digital discretion matters, navigating online platforms while organizing and surviving. And finally, today we'll hear from Rohan Grey, assistant professor at Willamette University College of Law, who has been involved with various legislative and policy initiatives, including the Stablecoin and Bank Licensing Enforcement Act, the Public Banking Act, the Electronic Cash and Secure Hardware Act, and the related #eCash campaign. And Rohan uses he, him pronouns. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Albert. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Leah, and everyone who joined us here today. My name's Albert Cahn. I'm the executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and I'm your resident Luddite for today's discussion because I am someone who comes to this discussion very much from a position of believing in cash and believing in the privacy that cash affords us, the unique privacy that it affords us. Because when we look at the history of the financial institutions here in the US and around the world, we see infrastructure of surveillance baked into the very DNA of international finance, whether it is the anti-money laundering controls put in place in the name of fighting tax evasion, whether it is the know your customer laws that were put in place in the name of fighting drug trafficking, or the measures that have been used to target basically every group that falls into disfavor with the government. And part of why I am so skeptical about the move to a centralized digital currency, and quite frankly, to any broad-based digital currency, whether decentralized or government-backed, is I do not believe that our regulatory structure will allow for the robust privacy protections that come from cash to be replicated in any electronic form. I can give a dollar bill to someone without it being monitored, without it being recorded, without any restrictions or regulations. I can carry it around in whatever amounts I want without there being any flagging. I can move it from place to place without automated reporting on it. But if you try to replicate any of those actions with our existing financial infrastructure, you are oftentimes going to hit tripwires that set alerts to government regulators. Now, when you try to do these same things through use of a decentralized cryptocurrency, well, guess what? You start to hit a lot of these same tripwires. Not only is cryptocurrency highly regulated when you transfer a cryptocurrency into hard fiat currency, but you also see, tracking built in to the way that cryptocurrency works. The distributed ledger that allows for decentralization also allows for decentralized surveillance. And when we look at the different design pathways that we have from potential central bank digital currencies, well, we have what seems to me a couple of very problematic paths. Either we're going to see a highly centralized model which allows the government to aggregate huge volumes of data about transactions that previously would have been done anonymously, untrackably through cash, or we're going to see a decentralized model where, as with Bitcoin and Ether today, the surveillance will be baked into the blockchain, into the distributed ledger. And I just think that for me, I grow really fearful about how the move to a cashless society and potentially the criminalization of anonymous financial transaction will become a way to target basically every aspect of governmental priorities, whether it's attacking the right to reproductive health care, whether it's attacking sex workers, whether it's attacking individuals who are undocumented. This is the power that financial surveillance gives government agencies. It is something that is truly terrifying. And I think also we should recognize, for those who are unsympathetic to the impact that this will have on the most marginalized communities in our country, there's also going to be the ways that these systems get it wrong. We already see lots of people being caught up in these sorts of automatic financial surveillance systems because of the ways that the rudimentary algorithms will get it wrong when trying to identify what is a suspicious transaction. For example, we work with members of the Muslim community who will often see Arabic language transactions flagged when they're simply innocuous. And that's the sort of error we'll see amplified, not just through the transition to a cashless society, but the ensuing surveillance that comes with it. So let me wrap up here because I'm at my time limit, and just saying, keep it private, keep paying with cash.
Great. Why don't we go to Jennifer next?
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Albert, and all of the other panelist speakers today. I'm really excited to be here. I am not necessarily pro or anti-CBDC. Our organization is fact-based and data generating, hopefully. So I'm really, really excited to be here on what I consider to be the most important discussion when it comes to digital currency, hands down. So without further ado, a little bit about Digital Dollar Project, because I think it will help anchor the perspective that I'm bringing to the conversation. We're a nonprofit that's focused on creating discussions around a US central bank digital currency. So you can think of us like you would a general think tank. We do activities like panels, such as this one, authoring papers, helping to provide education to some of our government partners, et cetera. What is unique about Digital Dollar Project's work is that we also have a testing program, what we call our pilot program. And this is where we're trying to take real life use cases or applications of a potential US central bank digital currency and test it and hopefully result and generate some empirical data for consideration. We hope that our government decision makers, who are, just to be very clear, the only decision makers in this process, are doing so through data consideration and data-driven decision-making. So our question at Digital Dollar Project, when we think about testing a central bank digital currency, is quite frankly, can it be private? Because I think we don't have the answers to that yet. So from a DDP perspective, we believe if there is to be a US central bank digital currency, it must retain and increase the dollar's global strength by adopting American ideals of individual privacy, not just consumer privacy, which was the language that was used in the Federal Reserve Board paper released in February. So maintaining the ideas of individual privacy and adapting financial privacy policies to a new digital environment. So we believe that individuals can benefit profoundly from having privacy, just like a business or an investor, a fiduciary, our government units. They all benefit in a myriad of ways from confidentiality. And we think that central bank digital currencies can strike an appropriate balance between privacy and those confidentialities and other social goods, and that will be a key differentiator of a US central bank digital currencies. Conversely, not understanding how to define and incorporate those technical requirements into a CBDC will result in failure. We believe that if the government were to release something that did not prioritize privacy in a very comprehensive way, it wouldn't be used. Folks would continue, Albert, to your point, to use cash for all the reasons that you laid out. So just a couple anchor points for today's conversation that I think are really good reminders as we talk about CBDCs, because central bank digital currencies in the US do not exist today. So when we're talking, I like to ask myself or remind myself really that critical choices have still not been made. And now is the time to have these types of conversations to understand requirements, use cases, technical capabilities, trade-offs. But it's important to remind ourselves that no decisions have been made at this point. When anyone is making a statement, asking if it's grounded in empirical data or an emotionally based statement, I make a lot of statements about central bank digital currencies that are anchored in my wishes and my fears around them, which mirror a lot of what Albert said before me. Grounding ourselves and just acknowledging what is real and what is something that we're anticipating or assuming is really important. Both are very important contributors to the conversation. And then I think also understanding whether you're talking about a CBDC that's iterating on today's digital financial infrastructure and adding in a narratively innovative CBDC, or if we're talking about building a new system that's potentially utilizing distributed ledger technology and a tokenized form of fiat currency. I think the distinction between these two is very, very important when it comes to privacy, because this is where for example, we might start to talk about the capabilities of a programmable CBDC, which is not possible, right, in today's system. So I'm just getting a warning here. So a couple of things I want to give food for thought for today's conversation, focused on privacy, right? So one, we must understand the tech, privacy enhancing techniques like zero knowledge proofs, homomorphic encryption, multi-party computation. They're all evolving now and are intended to confirm critical information about an individual engaging in a transaction without revealing the PII of that individual. But how do we know that that actually meets our privacy requirements? That's a real question. One side of the coin is tech, the other side is policy. It's critical that policymakers develop policy based on where the technology is headed rather than where it has been. So similarly, we should not build rules imposing traditional identity disclosure requirements just because we think that is the only way to satisfy a key policy objective. It is important that it is acknowledging that if we are to start to build new rules, it's a new way for the government to operate. How do we actually do that? Big question. And then finally, the US should be pursuing massive investments into public-private research efforts aimed at developing the world's most advanced privacy-enhancing tools. Safely ensuring privacy for the digital economy will be a core global competitive advantage. So here is where I would acknowledge everyone to continue to participate in these types of conversations. We don't have answers yet. We have a lot of questions. Be a part of making that noise. Respond to all calls for public comment coming out of state and federal regulators. And then my shameless plug will be join Digital Dollar Project and help us test, particularly raising the voices of communities that have not been traditionally included in our financial system so that they are being considered, their use cases are being considered in these early design conversations. Thank you.
Jennifer, thanks so much. And a quick reminder, I apologize that commenting for participants is not enabled. That said, if you have any questions you'd like to raise for the panelists, please use the Q&A function and we will make sure to ask it during the question and answer. And without further ado, I would love to hand it over to Alexandria.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the intro. As I said, my name is Alexandria LaRue. I am one of the executive directors of the SWAP USA. That is the Sex Workers Outreach Project USA. We are the national, so we cover the entire United States, and it's myself and Phoenix, and we are the two staff members there. We are also participant ran, and we have other organizations or sponsees that we also help and assist getting resources. I want you to know, as someone who works in advocacy, my lens is not just to see, I am not an expert in cryptocurrency, and I am not an expert in decentralized dollars, but I am an expert in advocacy, and I understand the data and understand decentralized money. The thing that I know that we are looking at, no matter what happens in the end of this, is we're looking at a gap that we always have. And that gap is always discrimination. It's always racism. It's always white supremacy and some form of capitalism. So when we're having these conversations, yes, we can talk about policy, but it is important to include the nuance within that conversation. And that is the people who would be left out were things to change. If you remember back in March, there was a large conversation around what would happen with certain credit card companies because the future was already happening in Australia. We see things happen in other countries, like law changes, policy changes happen, and things like getting a photograph or a biometric of someone's face isn't always possible if that person is surviving. What if they don't have a good enough internet connection? What if they don't have the internet at all? And with the laws changing or have changed with the way IDs are, that means they may not be able to get access into all public buildings, and that could include libraries. We're looking at a disparity that is much greater than what we are looking at in decentralized money. And I am inclined to feel the same way Albert does, because I know that cash doesn't discriminate. You can hand money to a person who is surviving and they are able to keep doing that. How do we bridge the gap from somewhere where digital money exists, where we can get cash into an actual person's hand? So my concern is always privacy. As a sex worker, as somebody who's a Black, disabled, trans sex worker, privacy is of the utmost importance to me and the people I serve who look exactly like me, who have my story as well. So when we're having these conversations with each other, we need to research and know what's around me. What are the neighborhoods around me? Because I can tell you the data of what's around me and what's around you possibly, but can you do that as well? Do you know your neighbors? And that's just your city and beyond. Do your cohorts know their neighbors? Do your colleagues know their neighbors? What do their communities look like? What would their neighborhood look like if right now, boom, drop down, decentralized, we have something that's not just research, but is actually in action? Not like what we have. I mean, in America, we have what, 2 projects right now that are in research compared to what, the 16 others that are in South America. We're in a very different place than the rest of the world, unfortunately. But that also gives us time to be able to figure out where our gaps are so we can meet those where they're at, to make a plan about privacy that includes people who may not be able to sit in this meeting with us, who don't have internet connection, and who may have never heard of Amnesty International. We need to make sure that that's our priority, not just what we're doing and saying about it. When we're raising money, cash is wonderful for a fundraiser, but not everyone may be able to have accessibility to leave the home. And does that accessibility, does that allow them to have an internet connection that's stable? Can we provide that? Is that available? And again, another gap that needs to be met, because we have all these things we need to do, but we have these people who cannot actually participate. And we're talking about a global majority of people. Us as people who are in charge, who do have privilege enough to sit here on this meeting to talk about this thing together in the middle of the day, it is our duty, our duty to make sure that in every single conversation that we have, that we're including the people who can't be here, but including people like myself who can represent those people. Because it's not about giving a voice to voiceless. They have voices. We need to make sure we're passing the mic to them, including them in meetings, compensating them if they are in a place that they need to be compensated for their knowledge, because without it, you wouldn't be able to have the data you needed or the research that's required to make sure that we're upholding them in that place. I want to say that, yes, Sex Workers Outreach Project, we're all about the decriminalization of sex work. That is our main goal, but we don't expect people to disclose to us every time we meet them. So we're about healing communities and building bridges and connecting resources. So I encourage everyone on this panel, everyone who is listening, to find out who your neighbors are, find out what's happening in your neighborhoods, because as we keep building those resources together, we can keep solving these problems in a more effective and equitable way. I appreciate you all.
Alexandria, thank you so much. And we'll hand it over to Rohan. Rohan, it's all you.
Hi, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me with such great panelists. I think this is a really important initiative, and I think it's really important that we're starting to identify this as the problem, rather than crypto per se or anything else, identifying this idea of cash and what it means into the digital world. I'm a big believer in cash. I think what it means beyond just the technology is really autonomy over your economic identity, the ability to buy something and not have to tell people who you are and apologize for why you're buying that, or explain why you deserve to be able to buy it, that the money itself in a monetary economy is enough. But I think it's important to note that the war on cash is bigger than just the last 10 years or 15 years. It goes back at least to the 70s, and we've seen a slow attrition of the right to have that kind of economic privacy, especially after 9/11. And this idea that if you are trying to be anonymous online or in the, in economic circumstances, you're doing something wrong. You have to prove why you should be allowed to just engage in basic economic activity. So when I look at the moment we're in now, I see it as a kind of radical moment where we have to actually do a lot of work to stay the same. We have to protect something that's been around for thousands of years, and that actually requires a lot of radical work. So I am skeptical of the current state of both crypto and the central bank digital currency discourse for 2 reasons. One is the crypto movement gave up, in my opinion, on real digital cash in the 90s and turned to this libertarian vision of a decentralized ledger where you're mining money like it's gold. And the idea of real cash, that is to say a greenback but digital, required engaging with the public and democracy and those messy political institutions. And it was a lot easier to say, hey, we won't do that, we'll just build technology. And I think the effect of that is that we gave up on a vision of what public money looks like. We think of money as just a technology, but there's a difference between a bank deposit and cash issued by the government. And even within the government, there's a big difference between money issued by the central bank and money issued by the treasury. So when I look at the debate right now, and we're talking about central bank digital currencies, I think we've already lost, because central bankers around the world do not care about privacy. They do not care about individual civil liberties. And given the choice between acquiescing to the NSA and acquiescing to the demands of African Americans and sex workers, we know what the Fed does, because it's been putting a boot on the neck of African Americans and marginalized workers for decades. So I don't think if we call this a central bank digital currency, we're going to win. And I don't think if we think that the central bankers get the final decision, we're going to win either. And for me, at least, watching this debate for at least 8 years now, the central bankers are already making decisions. Before they get to the public, the decision is going to be like a condescending parent says to a kid, do you want this vegetable or that vegetable? That will be the choice the public gets. And the constraint of that choice will be determined by groups like the BIS, very, very far away from the people who are most affected, over in Brussels or where else. So in my opinion, what we need to think about now is, first of all, the politics of where this is being made. The Treasury is the place that issues coins. The Treasury is the place that issues paper money. If we want people with expertise in making dollars and giving it out to people without asking how they get used, it's those kinds of people in government we should be talking to, not central bankers who are currently causing millions of people to go out of work in the name of price stability. These are not our friends. And if we continue to think they are, we're not going to go very far. And when it comes to cash itself, I believe we should focus very much on protecting physical cash, but recognizing that there's a huge amount of economic activity that will never be achievable in a digital economy with cash. And if we want to protect the value of cash, we need something that looks like a hardware-based peer-to-peer option, not based on a distributed ledger, not requiring some common central clearing system, but rather something that actually is a token in our hands. And I think the crypto community, unfortunately, has gotten so caught up in blockchain-based technologies that whole avenue of research has been largely under-discussed. You can see it in the MIT report. They mention offline capability in one paragraph and say it would require an entirely different model than they've been looking at for the last 3 years. They're not interested in it. So for me, at least, this is the big challenge, is to find all the groups that care and to force the conversation into a different room. Because if it stays in this room, we've lost. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for these fantastic presentations on this issue. I'm just thrilled to be here. So if anybody who's listening on Zoom has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we will get to them. I see some coming in. Thank you all so much. We already have one audience question that was posted via Albert, but I think that this during Albert's talk, but I think all of us could have some answers. And this audience member asks, as much as I agree with Albert's lordistic tendencies and outlook toward digital cash, there are some areas of finance you simply can't recreate with cash. I can't pay for web hosting or digital services with in-person cash. Even if as a society we were to re-embrace in-person cash, I think there's going to be a need for some digital representation of currency, and with that taken as a given, I would be curious to hear his thoughts on what privacy features he thinks digital cash should have. So maybe we should answer this one by making a bucket, starting with Albert. Anybody else who wants to toss privacy, features or things that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about privacy features specifically into that bucket, we could start it there.
It's funny when Rohan was talking about alternative models for digital cash, I was flashing back to work my dad did on cryptography around exactly this issue back in the 90s. Like, this is stuff that has been around for a while, that it's conceivable that you could have a digital cash that is not a blockchain, is not a centralized repository, is based off of essentially allows you to store units of value in a discrete way without reliance on these highly surveilled systems. I guess the problem, I think part of why I'm such a Luddite is I think that when we see efforts to replicate those sorts of privacy protections through different services that will, for example, take large amounts of Bitcoin and put it together into a large pot and then reallocate it as a way for people to have greater privacy protection about who the owner of a Bitcoin is. We see those sites getting shut down for money laundering. And so I guess part of why even if it's technically possible to have a digital currency that is untraceable, that is possible to be used without any of these surveillance capacities, I don't think as a practical reality governments will allow it, because I think there is a limiting principle to how much harm you can do with physical cash versus if you have the ability to move millions or billions through an untraceable digital system. So I will stick very much with the Luddite sort of silo with that answer.
Yeah, anybody else who wants to chime in? Rohan, was your hand up?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to respond. I mean, I think I obviously am very skeptical about the viability of this, right? I'm not a naive optimist that governments are going to turn around on this, but I think it is important for us to identify what we want, what we think is the good thing, because then we can identify everything else as not being that. What I see right now is the word digital cash getting thrown around by all sorts of models that have no resemblance to cash at all. And I want them all to be identified as frauds and posers, and to show that there's one thing that is actually serious and everybody else isn't. So yes, if this is what the government is going to crash and burn against, I'm fine with that, because I would rather say we need Medicare for all than to and not get it, than to sort of tolerate a Mitt Romney model and say that's the sort of option that is public healthcare. In terms of the values, I would say make it a bearer instrument, make it non-intermediated. One of the problems you see with those Bitcoin options is there's an intermediary. Money laundering is easy when there's someone in the middle, but if you're talking about a device you hold, there's nobody who can be accused of doing that. And then with regards to the limiting principle, I mean, I would say just look at our eCash Act language. It's a sort of starting point. It's not the end. But we think there should be a limiting principle, not because I care about that necessarily, but because that gets us past that problem. We have a $100 bill limit. We don't have $500 or $1,000 bills anymore. We could say that those devices will have built-in caps in them. And even if they can be broken, yeah, okay, we'll deal with that in the counterfeiting laws. But we don't get rid of cash just because there are risks of counterfeiting. So I think we should take those concerns seriously, but even if they're not actually going to happen, we can identify the lodestar we're working towards.
Alexandria and Jennifer, do you want to weigh in on this one, or should we go to the next question?
Alexandria, do you want to comment?
Honestly, I'm inclined, like what Rohan and Albert were saying, I feel like they've said it beautifully. I don't think there's anything I need to add to either of their commentaries.
So I will just provide a counter perspective to think about as we're going through this discussion. I don't necessarily disagree with the other points that have been made. I think other compelling arguments, and one that I feel very deeply personally actually is around a comment, actually, Alexandria, that you said when you started, which is really anchoring in on what does it look like to have universal access in a digitally native world. So a digitally native future where the majority of activity, exchange of goods for stores of value is happening through digital mechanisms. And I do have the same amount of concern around the government being the sole arbiter or collector of data and movement of money as I do around the private sector being the sole arbitrator and collector of data and movement of money. And I think if these are the two options that I have in front of me in modern society, where my brain will go is to where I feel I can find legal recourse and where I feel I can hold institutions accountable. And this is where I start to plug and play with applications of the Fourth Amendment, which is also still a very gray area in a modern digital society, or starting to look at how the government has prioritized cybersecurity at the cost of access to certain data. And I think that that's an important consideration of, if it's not the government, right, then who is it? Or is there a hybrid model? And to Rohan's point, what are our requirements around privacy? And don't stick with what we've done historically, but with our requirements in mind, think about then how we want to organize our institutions to serve our individual needs in this space. So I think that's very important. I also think that offline capabilities for any digital currency is critical for adoption. That's not just specific to the United States. I think if we don't figure that out, again, any country that releases without an offline capability is going to have massive adoption issues. And I do believe that the Fed is interested and working, as is MIT through the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, on understanding the technical capabilities for offline transacting. But it is all interwoven. I think it's really important also to acknowledge that the tech piece and the policy piece, and then this kind of third piece, which is the public's trust in money. And I can't remember, I'm sorry, who brought this up, but money exists because the public believes in it in large part. So anything that is designed in the future has to have a multitude of voices at the table, or it's just not going to be trusted. And again, I think that brings me full circle to, is it the private sector? Is it big tech? Is it the government? Where do we define privacy and trust, and who are the right institutions to spread that responsibility across?
And that's actually a great segue into the next audience question, which is that some within the crypto community believe the long-term end goal of cryptocurrency or other currency alternatives should be separating currency from the state. Regardless of one's position on cryptocurrency, the participant is curious if the panelists believe in that idea, whether we should support the separation of money from the state, or whether the benefits of state control over currency outweigh the harms. And why don't we start with Jennifer, and then Alexandria, Albert, and Rohan, if you guys would like to jump in.
So that's a philosophical question to answer. And I think it's a question, quite frankly, that is unfolding on Capitol Hill right now. So thank you, whoever asked it. I think it's a reflection of something that our politicians are debating, which is, what is the role of the central bank in the future? What is the role of our federal government in the future? What does it look like for our financial regulatory bodies, both state and federal, and what their remit is in this digital future? So I wish I had an answer. I don't, but I think it's happening, and it's a key part of how we start to define and think about requirements. Because if you don't believe that there is a role for the central bank in a completely digital future, then there is no need for you to think about requirements of central bank money, right? So it's kind of the root, actually, of all the conversation as I think about it. What I would say is that right now, what we have is a society that's based on rules and laws that are imperfect. I mentioned, right, the Fourth Amendment and kind of the very gray and spotty applicability when it comes to technology. I also think AML KYC is antiquated. The requirements around that and how we
explain what that
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, thank you, Michael. So anti-money laundering or know your customer rules are rules that financial institutions that are onboarding either an individual or a legal entity like a company to send and receive money. The institution that's onboarding them needs to meet these legal requirements, and they're known generally as AML, anti-money laundering, or KYC, know your customer. But they're based on patterns and technology and rules that are upwards of, I'm sure Rohan, Albert can probably, in their legal minds, 60, 70 years old at least, right? So when we think about what a future might look like, that's utilizing a completely different set of technologies and capabilities around data management and digital identity. It unlocks a lot of different ways to think about managing the balance between security and making sure that you're catching malicious actors versus everyday people who are just utilizing money. But back to the original question. So very quickly, what we have today are societies with governments, and we have a set of processes that we can go about, depending on what type of government you have, to be able to influence or impact change against the laws and regulations that are on the books now. So I would say I focus on what I can control in this moment, and then what I am working towards in the future. I think a society without some sort of accountability from a government entity, to me, doesn't feel like a society that I would know how to operate in. So that's a tough question for me to answer.
Thanks so much, Alexandria.
Well, it's a bit different for me because you must understand the DOJ currently does not define me as a human being. If I were to be killed today, it would be no human involved. That is the current definition of a sex worker under the DOJ. Policies or the government are not something that I, as a Black person, at the first and foremost, and I live in the South, I can't trust them. That means I cannot trust policymakers. That means I cannot trust the state when it comes to decisions that are this large. When we're talking about, as I said earlier, about white supremacy and capitalism, which go hand in hand, as we all know, we have to also talk about how these policies are made. And a policy that was made 60 or 70 years ago, we have to remember what was happening during that time or what had not happened yet at that time. And that's the Civil Rights Act. So anything that's pre-Civil Rights Act, I'm already weary of from a very, very, I would think, logical standpoint, as we all should be, because that means people, Black people included, but all people were being discriminated against at that time, and there weren't any laws or recourse. And though, as we all know, a law may say, well, this thing is against the law, it takes a lot longer for society to catch up, and sometimes it takes even longer than that. We see how our own state is. Our state controls our federal laws or controls our state laws. We're talking about our law enforcement as well, people who work for the city employees. I believe the people that should be in charge of these decision-making or this kind of decision-making should not just be state officials. It shouldn't be our government officials only. In fact, I don't believe anyone who has enough privilege to be a politician should be in charge of all of those decisions. Places like Amnesty International are good at curating people together. NESPA, around the world, sex workers who unite together to vote, and not only just vote, but keep track of what's going on in our countries and other countries. You have banking policy advocacy groups that are run by Black folks, people of Latin descent, Spanish descent, people who are Asian, people who would be left out of these conversations. And those are the people I would trust the most to be handling this kind of thing, because they know how to not only advocate for their own people, but also other people who are part of the global majority, but also understand banking and policy to a finite degree. And I think that is the most important thing, because we can't trust policy. Look at what happened during the pandemic. I don't need to bring up police brutality. We have years and years of it. Shouldn't have taken, this. Rodney King existed before that, and things existed before that, and Selma existed before that. We have to understand that people are scared and they don't have a whole lot of faith in a system that would rather see them behind bars than see them living their lives successfully, being able to be a part of these digital currencies, even a cash currency. We need to make sure that that's part of the conversation as well. And that's honestly what's most important to me.
Thank you very much. And Albert or Rohan, do you have a moment? Do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think, well, I think this question for me comes in two parts. One is, can you separate the currencies from the central banks? And on the other hand, can you separate currencies from all the other government agencies that now use their, surveillance of the financial system to exercise control and enact brutality? And so for me, I think, especially in light of all the history that Alexandria was referencing, it's very important to come up with models for financial institutions and financial governance, and whether it be how we manage cash or how we manage digital assets, that walls off the free-for-all that police have had to surveil financial transactions. We wouldn't accept a world where every word we say can be subject to police surveillance, and yet we accept one where nearly every digital dollar we spend is subject to that same level of surveillance. But then in terms of distancing cryptocurrencies or other currencies from the state, I think one of the defining features of a currency is that it is an instrumentality of a sovereign state. And I think that when we think about, governing a currency, especially during moments of financial instability, that I don't think there is a world, a viable world where we're able to manage, inflation, manage different, financial pressures, manage different crises without the ability to control the money supply as a country. I don't think, I think the problem is that we've translated that control over the money supply into control of so many other areas of life. And that's what I want to stop.
Thank you. And Rohan, do you have anything you want to say on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, this idea that you can separate currency from the state is sort of libertarian babble, frankly. I think it's a long-standing vision that doesn't map onto the history of money. There have been all sorts of money throughout history that have been issued by all sorts of actors, but it's occurred within governance regimes where there's been a public money at the same time. Anyone can create money. The challenge is to get it accepted. The question is there going to be a world where government's monies overall aren't accepted or aren't the most accepted? And I think the answer is no. And the reason is because if you want a market system, if you want a monetary economy, you need property rights, you need contracts, you need courts resolving disputes. If a court puts a judgment and says you can pay that judgment with X, that's money. If the court says treasury debt can now be repurchased and rehypothecated, treasury debt is money. So when we look at currency in a very narrow sense and we focus, only on a central bank, we lose sense of the way that money exists in 100 different forms, and they're all legally regulated. They're all governed through a multiplicity of public institutions. You can't get rid of that unless you're kind of thinking of a libertarian fantasy seasteading world where sort of you can abstract away from public schools and insurance and all that kind of stuff and somehow just have a thing that looks like digital gold. So I don't think that the way out here is to try to run away from a public. The only way out is through, but I am equally skeptical of public power. And I don't think the state is something that we should just uncritically embrace. And if you look at, for example, the civil rights movement, they push for a job guarantee as a legal right, not because they think the state is good, but because they want a right as an individual against the state. And the way that that gets actually manifested is through public goods, is through public money going into communities and giving people autonomy. And so when I think of anonymous money, we need to affirm the public value of anonymity against the state. We need to say that's such a strong value that if the state tries to get rid of that, we're marching in the street with pitchforks. That's the actual protection in my mind. And the historical failure of public money has been its outsourcing to private actors, mostly for-profit actors. Private banks issuing public money is the dominant model we have today, and it leaves out most people and it lets a bunch of bankers get filthy rich. Central bankers exist as the banker's bank. They are not the only representative of the monetary interest in government, and as long as they're the one that everybody goes to instantly in their mind, we're going to have a public monetary system run for the financial system. So I think it's really important in this moment to actually embrace public goods inherently. This should be issued by the mint. It should be administered by the mint. It shouldn't be a public-private partnership. And any for-profit company that's eyeing profit in the middle of this needs to be approached with deep suspicion.
Terrific.
Michael, can I just add one comment on to that? I would even go as so far, Rohan, to say that the infrastructure that moves money or stores of value in whatever form they are is a public good. And that infrastructure should not be built from a profit-centric perspective, and it should be done open source ethos and accessible and built by the people, right? Because those are the rails that are going to move the things we build on top of it. The second thing I want to say is I love this conversation because really what it brings to bear is the fact that we need, it's about the end user and the choices that are in front of them. And if we have specific use cases, for example, monetary policy applications where we think a CBDC would be helpful or beneficial for our government, let's call out that as a specific use case. And what are the requirements we need for our CBDC to fulfill that use case? If there are other use cases where we feel like a cryptocurrency or cash is a better option or could be defined as a better option by the end user, let's make that available for them, right? So I see no future, to be very clear, where it is just central bank money, just CBDCs kind of dominating the landscape. If we do this right, it's all about the choices that you have in front of you as an individual. And if you want to make a private transaction, you choose the medium that works for you. So thank you, everyone, because I feel, and Alexandria for kicking this off, I feel like that's kind of what we came through in this conversation. Thanks, Michael.
Fantastic. Okay, we have less than 10 minutes left. We're going to try to get to 2 more questions. I'm going to throw a manticore of a question at you, Alexandria. I apologize in advance. So it's kind of 2 parts. So how should people working on policy better tune into who is already left behind when it comes to our digital lives? Who do you recommend that they listen to? And I guess within that answer, if you could speak a bit or maybe give some examples of the financial exclusion that sex workers are already experiencing in our financial system, I think that would be a really valuable piece to add to this conversation.
Oh, you didn't even give me, this is easy stuff. So so the first question is, repeat the last half of it.
Yeah, so
who should be in these conversations?
Who should we be listening to? And some examples of the exclusion that's already being experienced.
The people you should be listening to in these conversations are the folks who are already doing the work. So grassroots organizers. So yes, there's a lot of like big organizations, and even sometimes SWAP is thought of as big, even though we're 2 staff members, but grassroots organizations that are already doing the work. So you have groups like, you have Assembly 4, who are doing panels and have talks, put out articles, and that are a tech company out of Australia that believe that what we're doing in America matters. You have, of course, us. You have Black Sex Workers Collective. They are constantly doing panels about information on technology. You have SWAP Los Angeles. They are a separate EIN and are doing amazing work. And as far as getting tax information out to people, because those groups are we already research. As being a sex worker, you're kind of like plugged into being an activist almost immediately. Because there are so many things going on and there's so many things that we are discriminated against. And to your second part of the question, bank accounts get closed, not because of any particular activity, but they won't say, they'll say, for XYZ reason that we won't reveal to you or tell you, we're closing your account. And it's everything from PayPal to Venmo to Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Bank of America and Wells Fargo, especially Bank of America, big one. They won't even be able to apply to cash wallets, to other cash wallets in the future. If they try to open up a business account, let's say I tried to open one with Square. I do art for a living. I wanted to have a nice little Square. I was like, oh yeah, they seem like the great one to go with. Decided to go with them. They rejected my application. Why? I don't know. There's no way of me knowing. Could it have something to do with this? I'm not sure, but I was able to get one with another financial institute very easily. The thing is, we don't know who has a policy or a moral policy against us before we actually do something. We don't know until we apply. And sometimes it's a case of they doing it while we already have an account open. So there are numerous stories of sex workers that have had PayPals, Venmos, Cash Apps where there was money in those accounts they no longer have access to, and they can't get that money out. It's gone. It's gone forever.
Oy. We have 3 minutes left, so we're going to do a completely unfair speed round where each panelist has 45 seconds to say one thing that they want the audience to take away from this conversation. And just going in the order I see you guys on my screen, it'll be Jennifer, Alexandria, Albert, and Rohan. Go.
That you have a voice, and that in the US, at least, we have not deployed. We are still researching, and to use every avenue that you can to share your voice and to create space for others to share their voice. That's it.
And make sure that you are checking in with your neighborhoods, see who your grassroots activists are in your city or town, and see how you can help them, along with keeping up everything that you can about decentralized banking and currency. It's happening. But most importantly, check your neighbors.
That low tech is good tech. That when we keep things analog, we keep them private, and that when we create these new systems, they may feel convenient to you, but they may feel dangerous to a lot of your neighbors. And so we have to recognize that these new platforms aren't just ways of, speeding up transactions or making something cool and flashy. They're really systems of control.
Yeah, we got a few years. This decision's going to be made one way or another in the next few years, so we have to act fast. And right now, if we don't have a strong affirmative vision, someone else's crappy vision is going to be the only thing that pushes us forward. And when we talk about cash, what we really mean is freedom and privacy, and we need to keep those values central when we actually use those words and when we discuss different models. Sometimes what seems like a reasonable political compromise is actually a long-term loss.
Fantastic. Thank you all so very much for joining us. I am absolutely thrilled to have had this conversation, and it seems like we should be having a lot more of them. So tune in to all these fantastic organizations, keep up with our work. Fight for the Future has a nospycash.com campaign going on where you can learn more as well. And yeah, I look forward to being in this fight with all of you. Thank you so much. And that'll wrap us.
And a quick apology to the participants whose questions we didn't get to. Please join us next time. We will try. And a huge thank you to Leah and Essie, who do the vast majority of the work organizing these, and to the panelists. Bye, guys.
Awesome.